My name is Enzo Blackwell, and I found out my brother stole my entire college fund on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, I was already 3 moves ahead of him. By Friday, his business empire was crumbling faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. He thought he was dealing with his naive little brother who wouldn't notice $200,000 disappearing from an account I'd never checked. What he didn't know was that I'd been watching him for months, documenting every lie, every forged signature, every illegal transfer. You see, Marcus always underestimated me. Called me the dreamer, the bookworm, the one who'd never amount to anything in the real world. But here's what he forgot about dreamers. We notice everything. We remember everything. And when someone tries to steal our future, we don't just get mad. We get methodical. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my dormitory study room, each drop creating tiny rivulets that caught the amber glow of the desk lamp. It was nearly midnight, and most of campus had settled into that particular quiet that only comes during finals week. The kind of silence punctuated by the distant hum of coffee machines and the occasional rustle of turning pages. I'd been hunched over my financial accounting textbook for the better part of 4 hours, my neck aching from the angle, when my phone buzzed with a notification that would change everything. It was an automated message from First National Bank, the kind of alert I'd set up months ago but had honestly forgotten about. Low balance warning for account ending in 7429. Available balance $247.32. I stared at the screen for a long moment, certain there had been some mistake. My college fund account should have had close to $200,000 in it, money my grandmother had left specifically for my education when she passed 3 years ago, money that was supposed to carry me through graduate school and beyond. I set down my pen carefully, the way you might handle something fragile when your hands are shaking. The study room suddenly felt too small, too warm despite the October chill seeping through the windows. I opened my banking app with deliberate slowness, the kind of movement you make when you're afraid of what you're about to discover. The loading screen seemed to take forever, those 3 dots pulsing like a heartbeat. When the page finally loaded, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Transaction after transaction, all authorized transfers, all going to the same destination, Blackwell Dynamics LLC. Each transfer was dated over the past 8 months, starting small, $5,000 here, $10,000 there, before escalating to massive chunks of $20,000 and $30,000 at a time. The most recent transfer, dated just 2 days ago, had cleaned out the remaining balance, except for the minimum required to keep the account open. I scrolled through the transfers with growing disbelief, my thumb moving mechanically across the screen. Every single authorization bore an electronic signature that looked exactly like mine. Too exactly like mine. Marcus had always been good with computers, but this level of sophistication suggested he'd put real effort into this theft, real planning. This wasn't some desperate grab for quick cash. This was a calculated dismantling of my future, spread out over months to avoid detection. My phone rang, startling me out of my trance. The caller ID showed Marcus, which felt like some cosmic joke. For a moment, I considered not answering, but curiosity won out. I needed to hear his voice to see if I could detect any guilt or nervousness in his tone. "Little brother," he said, his voice carrying that familiar mix of condescension and forced cheerfulness that had grated on me since childhood. "How's the studying going? Ready to conquer the business world yet?" I kept my voice level, neutral. "It's going well, just reviewing some material for tomorrow's exam." "That's my boy. You know, I was just thinking about you today, about how proud I am of everything you're accomplishing. Not everyone has the discipline to stick with something as demanding as your program." The irony was almost too much to bear. Here he was, talking about discipline and accomplishment while sitting on the proceeds of my stolen education fund. I found myself studying his words for hidden meanings, for any crack in his performance. "Thanks, Marcus. That means a lot coming from you. How's the business going? I saw some posts on social media about expansion plans." There was a brief pause, so subtle I might have missed it if I hadn't been listening for it. Oh, things are really taking off. We just closed a major deal that's going to change everything for Blackwell Dynamics. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks to get to the next level, you know. Speaking of which, I should probably mention I had to make a temporary adjustment to some of the family financial arrangements. Nothing major, just moving some money around for better investment opportunities. It's all going to work out better for everyone in the long run. The audacity was breathtaking. He was actually trying to spin this as a favor, as some kind of financial management on my behalf. I gripped the phone tighter, but kept my voice steady. What kind of adjustment? Just some reallocation from dormant accounts into active investments. Trust me, Enzo, when you graduate, you're going to thank me for this. The returns we're going to see will make that old savings account look like pocket change. I see. And you cleared this with everyone involved? Another pause, longer this time. Well, you know how these family financial things work. Sometimes you have to act quickly when opportunities arise. I'm handling all the details, you just focus on your studies. After we hung up, I sat in the silence of the study room, rain still pattering against the windows. Part of me wanted to call him back, to scream about the theft, to demand immediate restitution. But a cooler part of my mind, the part that had been shaped by 3 years of business courses and 2 summers interning at financial firms, recognized that emotional reactions rarely produced optimal outcomes. Instead, I opened my laptop and began to research. I started with Blackwell Dynamics LLC, the company that had been the destination for all those transfers. What I found was impressive, at least on the surface. Marcus had built what appeared to be a thriving logistics consulting firm, with a professional website, testimonials from satisfied clients, and news articles about their rapid growth in the Southeast market. The company claimed to specialize in supply chain optimization for mid-size manufacturing companies, and their client list read like a who's who of regional industry. But as I dug deeper, things started to feel less solid. The testimonials, while professional-looking, were all from companies I couldn't find much information about online. The news articles were mostly from small trade publications or local business journals, not the kind of coverage you'd expect for a company generating the kind of revenue necessary to justify $200,000 in investment. I spent the next 3 hours building a timeline. Every social media post Marcus had made about the business, every LinkedIn update about new clients and expanded services, every local newspaper mention of Blackwell Dynamics winning contracts or attending industry events. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. What emerged was a picture of a company that existed primarily in marketing materials and social media posts, with very little substance underneath. The breakthrough came when I started cross-referencing the addresses listed for some of their supposed clients. 3 of them were registered to the same virtual office service in Atlanta. 2 others had addresses that, when I checked them on Street View, turned out to be empty lots or residential houses. One client testimonial came from a company whose listed phone number had been disconnected for over 6 months. By 4 in the morning, I had enough evidence to paint a clear picture. Marcus had built an elaborate facade of business success, funded entirely by money stolen from my college fund. The company existed, but it was essentially a shell designed to launder the theft and create the impression of legitimate business investment. He'd been using my grandmother's money to pay for office space, marketing materials, and probably his own salary, while generating little to no actual revenue. I should have been angry. I should have been devastated. Instead, I felt something much colder and more dangerous: clarity. Marcus had made a fundamental error in judgment. He'd assumed I was still the naive younger brother who'd believe whatever story he fed me. He'd forgotten that I'd spent the last 3 years studying exactly the kind of financial manipulation he was attempting. More importantly, he'd underestimated my capacity for patience. I closed my laptop and gathered my things, moving quietly through the empty corridors of the dormitory. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air still carried that clean, electric smell that comes after a storm. As I walked back to my room, I was already forming a plan. Not a plan for confrontation or immediate retaliation, but something more comprehensive. Something that would not only recover my stolen money, but ensure that Marcus could never pull this kind of manipulation again. The first step was documentation. Over the next several days, I methodically compiled every piece of evidence I could find. Bank statements going back 2 years. Screenshots of every Blackwell Dynamics social media post and website update. Records of the company's registration with the state of Georgia. Corporate filings that showed Marcus as the sole owner and director. I even hired a private investigator, using money from my part-time job at the campus bookstore, to verify the addresses and phone numbers of the supposed clients. What the investigator found exceeded even my suspicions. Not only were most of the clients fictional, but several of the contracts Marcus had posted about on social media were completely fabricated. The investigator had posed as a potential client and actually met with Marcus at his office, a modest space in a shared commercial building that he dressed up to look much more impressive in photographs than it actually was. During my regular phone calls with Marcus over the following weeks, I began to probe more carefully. I asked innocent questions about the business, expressing admiration for his success and curiosity about his methods. He was eager to boast about his accomplishments, apparently enjoying the role of successful mentor to his younger brother. Each conversation gave me more insight into the scope of his deception and, more importantly, into the vulnerabilities in his constructed narrative. The key breakthrough came when Marcus mentioned in passing that he was in discussions with a major manufacturing company about a long-term consulting contract. He was clearly excited about the deal, describing it as the kind of partnership that would establish Blackwell Dynamics as a major player in the industry. When I asked for details, he was uncharacteristically vague, saying only that he couldn't discuss specifics due to confidentiality agreements. That evening, I used some of the research techniques I'd learned in my business intelligence course to identify the company he was likely targeting. It wasn't difficult. There were only a handful of manufacturers in the region large enough to justify Marcus's excitement, and only one that had recently posted job listings for supply chain consulting services. Within 24 hours, I had identified the company, Meridian Manufacturing, a family-owned operation that produced specialized automotive components. More importantly, I had identified the decision-maker Marcus would be pitching to, Sarah Chen, Meridian's director of operations, who, according to her LinkedIn profile, had an MBA from Northwestern and a background in logistics optimization. She was exactly the kind of sophisticated client who would ask hard questions and demand verifiable results. I spent the weekend crafting a careful email to Sarah Chen. I didn't identify myself as Marcus's brother or mention the stolen money. Instead, I presented myself as a graduate student conducting research on supply chain consulting firms in the Southeast. I explained that I was particularly interested in Blackwell Dynamics and wondered if she might have any insights into their reputation and track record in the industry. Her response came Monday morning and was more helpful than I dared hope. She confirmed that Marcus had indeed approached Meridian about a consulting contract, but she'd been unable to verify any of the client references he'd provided. Several of the companies on his reference list had never heard of Blackwell Dynamics when she'd called to inquire about their experiences. She'd decided not to move forward with the engagement due to concerns about the company's credibility. That was the moment I knew Marcus was in serious trouble, even if he didn't realize it yet. His business model depended entirely on maintaining the illusion of success. Without new clients to provide fresh cash flow, he would eventually have to account for the money he'd already spent. And since most of that money had come from my college fund rather than legitimate business revenue, that accounting would eventually lead to some very uncomfortable questions. But I wasn't content to simply wait for Marcus's house of cards to collapse on its own. I wanted to control the timing and manner of that collapse. More than that, I wanted to ensure that when it happened, every dollar of my stolen money would be recoverable. That meant I needed to understand exactly where the money had gone and how it could be clawed back through legal channels. I spent my Thanksgiving break, which I told my family I was using for intensive studying, conducting a forensic analysis of Marcus's business operations. Using public records and the information I'd gathered from my investigator, I was able to piece together a detailed picture of Blackwell Dynamics' financial structure. What I found was even more damaging than I'd expected. Marcus hadn't just been using my college fund to sustain his business operations, he'd been using it to fund an increasingly lavish lifestyle that he'd been passing off as business success. The expensive office space, the new BMW he'd been driving to client meetings, the designer suits, even the luxury apartment he'd moved into 6 months ago, all of it had been paid for with money stolen from my education fund. More problematically for Marcus, he'd been reporting this personal spending as business expenses on his tax returns. That meant he'd been committing tax fraud in addition to theft, creating federal liability that would be much more serious than the family financial dispute he probably thought he was dealing with. The final piece of the puzzle came when I discovered that Marcus had been using falsified financial statements to secure a business line of credit from a local bank. He'd inflated Blackwell Dynamics' revenue and assets, including listing my college fund money as company capital investment. That constituted bank fraud, another federal crime that would carry serious consequences. By the time I returned to campus after Thanksgiving, I had assembled a comprehensive case file that documented not just the theft of my college fund, but a pattern of fraud that extended across multiple areas of Marcus's business operations. I had evidence of tax fraud, bank fraud, false advertising, and identity theft. Any one of these charges would be serious. Together, they painted a picture of someone who had built his entire business on criminal activity. But I still wasn't ready to act. I wanted one more piece of information. I wanted to know exactly how much money Marcus had left and where it was located. If I was going to recover my college fund, I needed to move before he had a chance to hide or dissipate the remaining assets. That opportunity came in early December when Marcus called to invite me to his company's holiday party. He was clearly proud of the event, describing it as a celebration of Blackwell Dynamics' most successful year yet. He wanted me to see what he'd built, to understand the vision he'd been working toward. He had no idea he was about to give me a front-row seat to his own downfall. The party was held at one of Atlanta's most exclusive venues, a rooftop space with panoramic views of the city skyline. Marcus had spent no expense: premium bar service, gourmet catering, a jazz trio providing live music. The guest list included what appeared to be a mix of potential clients, industry contacts, and local business leaders. Everything was designed to project an image of success and sophistication. I arrived fashionably late, wearing my best suit and carrying myself with the quiet confidence I'd learned to project during my business school interviews. Marcus was in his element, working the room with practiced charm, introducing me to various guests as his brilliant younger brother who was following in his entrepreneurial footsteps. What struck me most about the evening was how completely Marcus had bought into his own performance. He wasn't just pretending to be successful for the benefit of his guests, he genuinely seemed to believe his own narrative. When he talked about the company's growth trajectory and future plans, there was real passion in his voice, real conviction. It was almost tragic in a way. He'd stolen my future to fund his own delusion, and he'd become so invested in that delusion that he'd lost sight of the reality underneath. But his conviction also created an opportunity. During a quiet moment when we stepped out onto the balcony to get some air, Marcus opened up about his financial situation in a way he never had before. He was feeling expansive, generous, riding the high of what he saw as his triumph. He talked about the cash flow challenges of rapid growth, about the investments he'd made that were just starting to pay off, about the major contracts that were going to transform everything in the coming year. More importantly, he let slip details about his business banking arrangements. Blackwell Dynamics maintained accounts at 3 different banks, he mentioned, as part of what he called a sophisticated cash management strategy. He even joked about keeping the accountants busy with all the different accounts and transfers they had to track. That information was exactly what I needed. With account numbers and bank names, my attorney would be able to move quickly to freeze assets once we initiated legal proceedings. Marcus had just given me the keys to recovering my stolen money. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Marcus pulled me aside for what he clearly intended as a meaningful moment. We stood on the balcony overlooking the city, the lights of downtown Atlanta spread out below us like a constellation of possibilities. "You know, Enzo," he said, his voice taking on that earnest tone he used when he wanted to sound wise and mentorly, "this is what I've been working toward all along. Not just the business success, but the ability to create opportunities for myself, for our family, for you. Everything I've done has been about building something bigger than any of us could achieve alone." I nodded thoughtfully, as if I were taking in his words with the reverence he expected. "It's impressive, Marcus, really impressive. You've built something substantial here." He smiled, clearly pleased with my response. "And this is just the beginning. Wait until you see what we accomplish next year. The contracts we're about to sign, the expansion we're planning, it's going to change everything." "I believe it," I said, and meant it. Things were indeed about to change everything, just not in the way Marcus expected. As I drove back to campus that night, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with satisfaction or revenge. It was more like the feeling you get when you finish a complex puzzle, when all the pieces finally click into place and the full picture becomes clear. I had everything I needed to recover my stolen money and ensure that Marcus faced appropriate consequences for his crimes. But more than that, I had gained something I hadn't expected, a deep understanding of how fragile the structures we build really are, and how important it is to build them on solid foundations rather than borrowed time. The next morning, I called my attorney. The law offices of Morrison, Hayes & Associates occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Atlanta, the kind of building that whispered power without shouting it. I sat in the reception area on a Tuesday morning, watching the city wake up through floor-to-ceiling windows while waiting for my appointment with Rachel Morrison herself. I'd specifically requested the senior partner because what I was about to set in motion required someone with both the expertise and the authority to move quickly when the time came. Rachel Morrison was exactly what I'd expected from her reputation: sharp, direct, and completely focused. She listened without interruption as I laid out the entire situation, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad, but never breaking eye contact. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me for a long moment. "This is comprehensive work, Enzo, very thorough. Most people in your situation would have confronted their brother immediately or gone straight to the police. You've built something much more strategic." She flipped through the documentation I'd provided, pausing at certain pages. "The federal charges alone would put him away for years, but the civil recovery case is what interests me most. We can get your money back, probably with penalties and interest." "What's the timeline?" I asked. "For maximum impact, we coordinate everything to happen simultaneously. Criminal referrals to the FBI, asset freezing orders, civil suit filing, and notification to his business creditors all on the same day. Complete financial lockdown before he has time to react or hide anything." She made another note. "But I have to ask, are you prepared for the family consequences? This isn't going to be something you can take back." I thought about Marcus at his holiday party, so convinced of his own narrative, so completely unaware that his house of cards was about to collapse. He made his choice when he forged my signature. I'm just making mine. Over the next 2 weeks, Rachel and her team worked with surgical precision to prepare what she called the package. Federal prosecutors were briefed on the evidence for bank fraud and tax evasion. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation received documentation of the identity theft and computer crimes. Asset freezing orders were prepared for all 3 of Marcus's bank accounts. A comprehensive civil suit was drafted seeking not just the stolen $200,000, but treble damages under federal racketeering statutes. The beauty of the strategy was its coordination. Everything would hit Marcus simultaneously, from multiple directions, leaving him no time to mount a defense or attempt damage control. Meanwhile, I maintained my normal routine. I attended classes, worked my shifts at the bookstore, and called Marcus regularly to check on his business progress. He was riding high on what he saw as momentum, full of enthusiasm about deals that were supposedly just around the corner. The irony was almost painful. He was planning his future with money stolen from mine, completely oblivious to the trap closing around him. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday morning when Marcus called with news he could barely contain. "Enzo, I've got incredible news. Remember that manufacturing contract I mentioned? It's happening. They want to move forward with a 6-month pilot program worth almost $400,000. I felt my stomach drop. "That's amazing, Marcus. Who's the client?" "Meridian Manufacturing. They do automotive components." The operations director was initially hesitant, but I think I finally convinced her of the value proposition. We're supposed to sign the preliminary agreement next week. This was a problem. Sarah Chem had already told me she'd decided against working with Blackwell Dynamics due to credibility concerns. Either Marcus was lying about the deal, or he'd somehow convinced her to reconsider, or he was planning to forge documents to make it appear the deal existed. Any of those scenarios created complications for my plan. I called Rachel immediately after hanging up with Marcus. "We may need to accelerate the timeline. He's claiming to have landed a major contract that I know doesn't exist. If he's planning to use forged documents to secure additional financing, we need to move before he commits additional crimes." "How confident are you that the contract doesn't exist?" "Very confident. I have email correspondence from the supposed client indicating they decided against working with him weeks ago." I paused. "Unless he's managed to change their mind somehow. Let me make some calls."
If he's about to commit additional fraud, we can't wait for our original timeline. That afternoon, Rachel called back with an update that changed everything. I spoke with an attorney at Meridian Manufacturing. They confirmed that they have no intention of contracting with Blackwell Dynamics and never authorized any preliminary agreements. However, they received a call this morning from someone claiming to represent their company, asking about contract signing procedures and payment processing. The implications were staggering. Marcus wasn't just planning to lie about having the contract. He was planning to impersonate Meridian representatives to create false documentation that he could use to secure additional financing. It was fraud on a scale that went far beyond stealing from my college fund. "We're moving tomorrow," Rachel said. "I'm filing for emergency asset preservation orders tonight. The FBI will execute search warrants at his office and residence at 8 a.m. Asset freezes go into effect at 9 a.m. By noon tomorrow, your brother's world is going to look very different." That evening, I sat in my dorm room trying to focus on studying for an upcoming exam, but my mind kept drifting to what tomorrow would bring. I thought about calling Marcus one last time, maybe trying to give him a chance to come clean and return the money voluntarily, but I knew it wouldn't work. He was too invested in his own mythology, too convinced that he was the hero of his own success story. Instead, I called my parents. I hadn't told them about the theft yet, hadn't wanted to involve them in what I'd hoped could be resolved quietly. But they deserved to know what was about to happen, deserved a chance to prepare for the storm that was about to hit our family. My father answered on the second ring, his voice carrying that particular tiredness that came from working double shifts at the plant. "Enzo, good to hear from you, son. How are finals treating you?" "Dad, I need to tell you something important about Marcus and about some money that's gone missing from my college account." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of my life. I watched my father's voice change as I explained the situation, heard the exact moment when disappointment replaced confusion, when anger replaced disbelief. My mother got on the extension halfway through, and I had to explain everything again, walking them through the evidence while they struggled to process that their older son had stolen from their younger one. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Enzo?" my mother asked, her voice small and strained. "Maybe there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "I've triple-checked everything, Mom. I've had investigators verify the details. I've seen the forged signatures. There's no misunderstanding." My father was quiet for a long moment after I finished. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but cold. "What do you need from us?"
Just be prepared. This is going to be in the news. Marcus is going to call you, probably asking for help, maybe asking for money for lawyers. You need to decide how you want to handle that. He stole your future, my father said simply. That's not something a family fixes with a conversation and a promise to do better. After we hung up, I felt both relieved and hollow. My parents had always been fair people, but I'd worried they might ask me to handle this quietly, within the family, to protect Marcus from the consequences of his choices. Their support meant everything, but it also made the whole situation feel more final, more real. I barely slept that night. I kept imagining Marcus in his expensive apartment, probably working late on fabricated contracts or forged documents, completely unaware that federal agents were preparing search warrants with his name on them. Part of me felt sorry for him. He'd created such an elaborate fantasy that tomorrow's reality was going to hit him like a physical blow. My alarm went off at 7 a.m., but I'd been awake for hours. I made coffee and sat by my window, watching the sunrise paint the campus in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere across the city, Marcus was probably just waking up, maybe reviewing his talking points for whatever fake meeting he'd scheduled, maybe admiring his reflection in the bathroom mirror of an apartment paid for with my stolen money. At exactly 8 a.m., my phone rang. Rachel Morrison's voice was crisp and professional. Phase 1 is complete. FBI agents are currently executing search warrants at both his office and residence. They've seized computers, financial records, and what appears to be a substantial amount of forged documentation. Asset freezes go into effect in 1 hour. Any complications? None so far. Your brother was at his office when they arrived, apparently tried to claim the computers contained privileged client information and couldn't be seized. The agents weren't impressed with that argument. I found myself wondering what Marcus was thinking in that moment, whether he understood immediately what was happening or whether he still thought this was some kind of misunderstanding that could be explained away, whether he realized yet that his carefully constructed world was crumbling in real time. At 9:15, Rachel called again. Asset freezes are in place. All 3 business accounts are locked, along with his personal accounts. The bank that extended his line of credit has been notified of the fraud allegations and has suspended access to those funds as well. Conservatively, we've frozen about $350,000. The number hit me harder than I'd expected. $350,000. My stolen college fund had been worth $200,000, which meant Marcus had somehow generated an additional $150,000 through his fraudulent activities. The scope of his deception was even larger than I'd realized. What happens next? Now we wait for his response. He'll hire an attorney, probably try to claim this is all a misunderstanding or a family dispute that got out of hand. But the evidence is overwhelming, and the federal charges make this much more serious than a simple theft case. I attended my morning classes in a strange state of suspended animation, going through the motions of normal college life while knowing that somewhere across the city, my brother's life was imploding in real time. I kept checking my phone, expecting calls or texts from family members, but everything remained quiet. The first sign that word was spreading came during my lunch break, when I received a text from my cousin David. "Just saw something on the news about Marcus. Are you okay?" I realized I hadn't considered that this might become a media story, but of course it would. Local businessmen arrested on federal fraud charges was exactly the kind of story that local news stations loved. I found the story online within minutes. The headline read, "Atlanta consultant charged with bank fraud, identity theft." The article was brief but damaging, mentioning the seizure of records from Blackwell Dynamics and allegations of falsified client testimonials. Marcus's professional headshot stared back at me from the screen, the same confident smile he'd worn at his holiday party just weeks earlier. My phone started ringing around 2 p.m. The first call was from my Aunt Linda, Marcus's godmother, who wanted to know if I knew what was happening and whether there was anything the family could do to help. I explained the situation as gently as I could, emphasizing that this wasn't a family dispute, but a serious criminal matter that was beyond anyone's ability to fix with good intentions. The second call was from Marcus himself. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. When I picked up, his voice sounded completely different from the confident entrepreneur I'd been talking to for months. It was smaller, strained, almost pleading. "Enzo, thank God, I've been trying to reach everyone. This is all a huge misunderstanding. The FBI, the lawyers, all of it. Someone has fed them false information about the business, made it look like something it's not." I kept my voice neutral, careful. "What kind of misunderstanding?" "They're claiming I forged documents, that I stole money from family accounts. It's insane. I've been working 18-hour days to build this business, to create something that would benefit all of us, and now they're treating me like some kind of criminal." The denial was so complete, so committed, that for a moment I almost wondered if he actually believed it, whether he'd convinced himself so thoroughly of his own narrative that he genuinely couldn't see the criminal behavior underneath. "Marcus, I need to ask you something directly. Did you take money from my college fund without permission?" There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was even smaller. "It was never supposed to be permanent. It was an investment, a way to generate better returns than that savings account was producing. I was going to pay it back with interest as soon as the business cash flow stabilized." "So you did take it?" "I borrowed it. There's a difference. And I was going to pay it back, probably within the next few months. This legal action has just frozen everything before I could make the repayment." The rationalization was breathtaking. Even now, facing federal charges, he was still trying to frame the theft as a business decision rather than a crime, still trying to cast himself as the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own downfall. "Marcus, you forged my signature on electronic transfers. You used that money to pay for personal expenses while reporting them as business costs on your tax returns. You created fake client testimonials and falsified contract documents. That's not borrowing, that's fraud. Who told you that? Who's been feeding you this information?" His voice was getting sharper, more defensive. "Enzo, you don't understand how business works at this level. Sometimes you have to be creative with paperwork, especially when you're dealing with bureaucratic banking systems that don't understand innovative financing structures." Innovative financing structures? I couldn't keep the disbelief out of my voice. "Marcus, you stole my college fund and used it to rent an expensive office and buy a BMW. I invested your college fund in a business that was going to generate returns far beyond anything you could have achieved with traditional education financing. You should be thanking me, not working with prosecutors to destroy everything I've built." That was the moment I realized Marcus was never going to take responsibility for what he'd done. In his mind, he was still the visionary entrepreneur who'd been wrongfully targeted by a system that didn't understand his methods. The evidence, the federal charges, the frozen assets, none of it had penetrated his fundamental belief in his own righteousness. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Marcus. I really am. But what you did was illegal, and there have to be consequences." "Consequences? Enzo, if this case goes forward, it's going to destroy me completely. My credit, my reputation, my ability to ever work in business again. Is that really what you want? Is your college fund worth destroying your own brother's life?" The emotional manipulation was clumsy but persistent. He was trying to make me feel responsible for his situation, trying to frame my legal action as an attack on family rather than a response to his crimes. But I'd had months to think about this moment, months to prepare for exactly this conversation. "You destroyed your own life when you decided to steal from me. I'm just making sure there are appropriate consequences for that decision." We hung up without saying goodbye. I sat in my dorm room for a long time afterward, feeling drained and sad and relieved all at once. Part of me had hoped that when confronted with irrefutable evidence, Marcus would finally admit what he'd done and try to make things right. Instead, he doubled down on denial and blame shifting, confirming that I'd made the right choice in pursuing legal action. Over the next several days, the story continued to develop. More details emerged about the scope of Marcus's fraudulent activities. Local news stations interviewed some of the fictional clients whose testimonials had appeared on the Blackwell Dynamics website, revealing the extent of the company's deceptive marketing practices. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation announced that they were reviewing Marcus's tax returns for evidence of additional crimes. The family consequences were exactly as difficult as I'd expected. Several relatives called to ask if there was any way to resolve this privately, to keep Marcus out of prison while still getting my money back. I had to explain repeatedly that the federal charges were beyond my control, that even if I wanted to drop the civil case, the criminal prosecution would continue based on the evidence the authorities had seized. My parents handled the situation with a dignity that made me proud. When reporters called asking for comment, my father simply said that they supported both their sons and hoped the legal system would determine the truth. When Marcus called asking for money for legal fees, my mother gently but firmly explained that they couldn't help him fight charges related to stealing from his brother. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after Marcus's arrest. Rachel Morrison walked me through what to expect, explaining that this would primarily be a procedural matter where the government would present basic evidence and Marcus's attorney would enter a plea. I wouldn't need to testify, but she wanted me to attend so I could see the process firsthand. The federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta was an imposing building of marble and granite designed to communicate the weight and authority of the law. I arrived early and sat in the back of the courtroom, watching as lawyers and court staff prepared for the day's proceedings. When Marcus was brought in, wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, I barely recognized him. The confident entrepreneur from his holiday party had been replaced by someone who looked smaller, older, defeated. His attorney was a well-dressed woman who looked competent but not confident. She spent several minutes conferring with Marcus in whispers before the judge called the case. When asked to enter a plea, Marcus stood and said, "Not guilty," in a voice so quiet the judge had to ask him to repeat it. The federal prosecutor laid out the charges in clinical detail. Bank fraud for using falsified financial statements to secure credit. Tax fraud for reporting personal expenses as business costs on your tax returns. Identity theft for forging electronic signatures. Wire fraud for using electronic communications to perpetrate the scheme.
Each charge carried a potential sentence of multiple years in federal prison. Marcus's attorney requested that he be released on his own recognizance pending trial, arguing that he had strong ties to the community and posed no flight risk. The prosecutor opposed the request, citing the substantial amount of money involved and evidence that Marcus had been planning additional fraudulent activities at the time of his arrest. The judge listened to both arguments before announcing that Marcus would be released on a $50,000 bond with the condition that he surrender his passport and remain within the state of Georgia. As court officers removed his handcuffs, Marcus looked around the courtroom until his eyes found mine. For a moment, we stared at each other across the space between us. I saw no anger in his expression, no blame or resentment, just a kind of hollow recognition, as if he was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd lost. Outside the courthouse, Rachel Morrison briefed me on next steps. The criminal case would take months to resolve, but the civil asset recovery could move much faster. She was confident that we could recover the full amount of my stolen college fund within 60 days, along with interest and penalties that would bring the total to nearly $250,000. What about the additional money he generated through the fraud, the $150,000 beyond my original fund? That becomes more complicated. Some of it will go to other creditors, some will be seized by the government as proceeds of crime. But there's a good chance you'll see additional recovery beyond your original losses. As I walked back to my car, I realized that despite everything I'd been through, I felt surprisingly little satisfaction. Marcus's downfall had been comprehensive and swift, exactly as I'd planned. But watching him in that courtroom, seeing him reduced from the confident entrepreneur he'd pretended to be to the hollow figure in an orange jumpsuit, I felt mostly sadness. He'd stolen my future, but in doing so, he'd destroyed his own. The business he'd built with my money was gone. His reputation was ruined. His relationships were damaged, probably permanently. He faced years in federal prison and would emerge with a criminal record that would make legitimate business opportunities nearly impossible. I'd won, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the conclusion of a tragedy that hadn't needed to happen, that could have been avoided if Marcus had simply been honest about his struggles or asked for help instead of choosing theft and deception. The full resolution came faster than anyone expected. 2 weeks after the preliminary hearing, Marcus's attorney called Rachel Morrison with a proposal. Marcus wanted to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a recommendation of the minimum possible sentence.
More importantly for my case, he was prepared to cooperate fully with asset recovery efforts and provide detailed documentation of where all the stolen money had gone. The plea agreement was finalized on a Tuesday morning in February. I attended the hearing where Marcus formally admitted to each of the charges against him, acknowledging that he had indeed stolen my college fund and used it to support fraudulent business activities. His voice was steady as he answered the judge's questions, but he never looked in my direction. The judge accepted the plea and scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. Based on federal guidelines and Marcus's cooperation, he would likely serve between 18 and 24 months in federal prison, followed by supervised probation. It was serious time, but less than he could have received if the case had gone to trial. More immediately relevant to my situation, the asset recovery moved into final phase. Within a week of the plea agreement, Rachel Morrison had negotiated the return of $237,000, my original college fund plus interest and penalties. Additionally, I would receive another $48,000 from the liquidation of Marcus's remaining business assets, bringing my total recovery to nearly $285,000. The money was transferred back to my college fund account on a Friday afternoon in early March. I logged into my banking app and stared at the balance for a long time, feeling a complex mix of relief and melancholy. The number was actually higher than my original fund had been, but the cost of getting it back had been enormous for everyone involved. That weekend, I drove down to my parents' house for what would be our first family dinner since Marcus's arrest. The conversation was careful, polite, everyone working hard to navigate around the obvious absence. My father asked about my classes and my summer internship prospects. My mother talked about her garden and the recipes she'd been trying. No one mentioned Marcus until after dinner when my father and I were sitting on the back porch watching the sunset. "Do you think he understands what he did?" my father asked quietly. "Really understands, not just the legal consequences, but the betrayal?" I thought about Marcus in the courtroom, about the hollow look in his eyes when he entered his guilty plea. I think he's starting to. It's going to take time for him to process how he got from wanting to build a business to stealing from his own brother, but yeah, I think he's beginning to understand. My father nodded slowly. "Your mother and I have been talking about visiting him, not to excuse what he did, but because he's still our son. Would that bother you?" "No, Dad, it wouldn't. What he did to me doesn't change what he is to you and Mom. I hope you do visit him. I hope he has people who care about him through this." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds of suburban Georgia. Eventually, my father spoke again. "I'm proud of how you handled this, Enzo. You could have let anger drive your decisions, but you stayed focused on what was right rather than what felt good. That takes maturity." "I just wanted my future back," I said simply. "Everything else was just the cost of making that happen." The sentencing hearing was held on a warm Thursday morning in April. Marcus appeared before the judge wearing a suit rather than jail clothing, looking more like the businessman he'd once pretended to be. His attorney presented letters from family members and former colleagues asking for leniency and describing the Marcus did known before his legal troubles. The judge listened carefully to all the presentations before announcing that Marcus would serve 21 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. He would also be required to pay full restitution to all victims and perform 500 hours of community service focused on financial literacy education. As the hearing concluded and Marcus was led away, I felt a sense of closure that had been building for months. The legal process was finished. My money was recovered. Marcus would serve his time and hopefully emerge with a better understanding of the consequences of his choices. Our family would heal, slowly but eventually. Walking out of the courthouse that final time, I realized that the experience had changed me in ways I was still discovering. I'd learned that I was capable of patience and strategic thinking under pressure. I'd learned that doing the right thing doesn't always feel satisfying in the moment, but it leads to outcomes you can live with long term. Most importantly, I'd learned that protecting your future sometimes requires making difficult decisions about the people you love. My college fund was restored, but my education had extended far beyond any classroom. I'd earned a degree in justice, in consequence, in the complicated mathematics of family loyalty and personal integrity. It was knowledge I hoped I'd never need to use again, but knowledge I was grateful to possess. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.